How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, you're right. Sure talk. You got it. It's perfect.
I know, I know. For whatever reason, like I've known if I know people for years, all of a sudden I get nervous that I'm gonna say their name wrong or something. Because I've done that before.
It
I've
was it
done
was
that before.
flawless. That's all right.
So, so man, I was thinking like, everyone must be doing all these live streams and all these chats online, but we've been doing this for years. This is nothing new to us. We did this before. It was cool.
I know. I mean, it feels very natural. Although usually I'm the one who's kind of putting you in the hot seat. I'm the one asking you the questions.
I know, I know. This is a little strange. So I like spend
Yeah.
like a good hour before this, like writing down a bunch of stuff, just so I have some good talking points. But
Yeah.
anyways, it's just and also I like this because I never get to ask you how you're doing. You always even if we talk for like a few minutes about how you are, we always divert it to me, which I appreciate. That's your job, but I almost feel like selfish or guilty in my own ways for that. So
Now,
get to
I love you for saying that, but honestly, no one really ever asks me how I'm doing, and that's it's a distraction away from having to talk about myself because I think I find myself way more comfortable like talking about other people's stuff, and then when people do ask me, well, how are you doing, Greg? It kind of takes me back. It's not in my comfort zone.
well, is it like something where you're in such a zone that you're not even in your own world talking about your own life. You're in like, okay, what's going on with this guy? How can I
That's
work with
true.
him? Yeah.
And
So
you know what's interesting, Johnny, is that if you look at the research behind like, what ensures survival if you're going through something like life-threatening or some kind of disaster, that oftentimes people assume that like when you take care of yourself first, when you look out for yourself, that ensures your survival. But actually, like being there for others. I think I put out an Instagram video recently about this. That when you're there for someone else, it makes your own survival more likely. So I find myself in these last 5 or 6 weeks, rather than being quarantined up and sitting in isolation thinking about how shitty things are or how
mhm.
inconvenient my life is or how the kind of hit economically things have been in this current climate. I'm dedicating my time to being there for other people, which it serves as a distraction, but it also reinforces some important things that I think it makes it easier for me to kind of digest my own advice when I'm consistently giving it. So
Yeah,
it's serving others, but also helping me. I love that about my job.
that's interesting. Yeah, I guess the conversations have changed a lot over the last couple of weeks with the people that you had talked to. It's not so
Yeah.
much what you're doing, but kind of like what we can do now. Is not to get too much into it, but it's been kind of like that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, it was purely, in January, February, it's performance enhancement. Like, how can you get ready for the tournament? How can you prepare for what's to come in your competitive life? And it's now about coping emotionally with like not having that. Like, how are you dealing with the loss? How are you spending your time at home? What kind of habits are you building? But it's really about coping with the like really difficult loss of not having this thing, which for most athletes makes up most of their identity. I'm guessing, especially for high level athletes like you, like
Yeah.
having that abruptly taken away. It's not even like you were given a lot of warning. I mean, you were on a plane, right? You were on a plane, and then immediately were told when you came off that the competition was off. So we had no warning, not on our own terms, stripped away of our largest part of ourselves, and that sucks for a lot of us.
Yeah, it definitely took like an adjustment. I definitely think it like took me talking to you. I remember the biggest thing what for us or for me, like people ask, "Oh, how did I cope?" And I remember it was actually talking to you because the first few days when everything happened, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a schedule. I was going to
Yeah.
bed at 3 a.m. every day, eating pizza at 1 a.m. And then waking up at noon and not being so sure what to do. I'm like, yeah, maybe I'll do a little exercise here and there. But you like really helped me like develop a schedule and kind of stay on point. And I feel like that's been the biggest thing, not only for me, but I've noticed for a lot of people that I've talked to about it as well, is just kind of trying to stay regimented in your own way.
Yeah.
I
That's
feel
so
like that
true.
was super helpful for me. Yeah.
And I always know when you're like at your training weight just based on the shape of your face. When I
Oh,
see that I'm like, okay,
yeah.
Johnny's getting ready, and after a couple of pizzas, I can also tell. Oh, I'm like it. But it's tempting to not like be on a schedule when your existing schedule is off. But if we're looking, Johnny, at one of the most fundamental mental skills ideas in the field of performance psychology. It's that you can't control anything or anyone else but yourself. You can't
Yeah.
control the situation, but you can always control your reaction to it or your response to it. And so, as mentally trained as you are, and a lot of high performers are, when something unexpected like this happens, it can be easy to forget that and to
Yeah.
put our attention on what's happening as opposed to what we can do about what's happening.
Well, I always appreciate what you told me, and it kind of helped me find positives in any situation. What was the quote? It's like nothing is good or bad, but it's how your mind makes it or how you approach it
And
that
so,
makes it so.
and I promised you instant social status and attraction by a number of ladies. I think I said, if you want to impress the ladies, you quote Shakespeare. This was a Shakespeare quote. See, and you've clearly forgotten it already, so it probably hasn't been working.
Yeah, no, not really.
So I'll reignite the spark here. Nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Okay.
In other words, nothing nothing is factually good. Nothing is factually bad. Everything is neutral. Everything is what it is until you affix a positive or negative label to it. Like your haircut right now, it's really tempting for me to say, "Oh man, Gianni, awesome haircut, bro." But the reality is that your haircut isn't nice. It's not ugly. It's a haircut. But the moment I label it as good or bad, then that becomes the reality in my mind. And nothing is objectively good or bad. It's really how we choose to interpret it.
Yeah, but actually, what do you think of it though? My roommate did it. My roommate did
To
this.
be quite honest, it looks real hot. It looks great, man.
It looks good. It looks good. Yeah. I mean, he got my parents' approval and everything. That was a little scary there. I wasn't too sure, but it worked really good.
The fact that you got the professional approval by the hairdressers themselves, that's a big thing.
Well, I sent it to my parents, and I was like, oh man, I don't know. They're pretty critical. They can be harsh, and they were all for it. They were like, oh, it's great. I don't know if they were just being nice or what, but they went along with it. So
no, that looks great.
Yeah,
but again, enough about you and your haircut. Let's bring it back to
you. Yeah. Come on, this is the one time we talk about you. So I mean, what adjustments have you had to make during this time? Like, so you helped me find a schedule, but like, what have you been able to do during this time to, kind of cope with everything?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the demands of my life and your life, Gianni, are different only because I have 3 young kids. I have a family, which changes the dynamic of how I spend my day. But as opposed to in the past, when the kids would be at preschool or daycare or elementary school, they're now being homeschooled. So, and I'm sure I'm not the only parent. I think this is a commonality among a lot of working parents, is that my wife is also a full-time employee. She's an elementary school teacher. It's like a sprinting act. Like she'll sprint downstairs in the morning, and I'll have them for homeschool period in the morning time, and then we'll kind of switch, like literally sprinting from one room to the other, and she'll kind of take care of the afternoon while I'm taking care of my own work. So it's the balance between, ensuring the advancement of my children, which oftentimes I leave in the hands of teachers or, daycare people who I trust and I love. And I'm not looking to interpret this as like a dread, but it's mildly heavy to focus on my work, but also on like the 24/7 caring of children. Like the of them are like when you have a 2-year-old, it's not conducive to independent living yet. So and it's an interesting question, because I think coping is something that happens when you take something and you directly deal with it, when you address it. Like if I were coping with an argument we had, I would call you and I would say, Gianni, I wasn't happy with what you said before. Let's talk it out. And I feel like I'm sure with a lot of other people, that with like the hectic nature in which I'm spending my day with the kids and then with work and then dinner and bath and then more work, that like there's only a 30-minute period at the end of the day where I sit down and I think, holy shit, like I'm kind of feeling stressed. I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed, and that's the time I talk to my wife about it. And so I think like in the short term, it feels good to be so busy with things where you're not coping, but it's an absolute band-aid. I mean, you can't go through life freely and lightly and effectively by distracting yourself, which is the opposite of coping, by distracting yourself from like what's going on here. Which is why one of the things I talk to my athletes about is like right when you start to feel the stress or the heaviness or the fatigue or the confusion or sadness about what's happening, don't sweep it under the rug. Don't push it aside, because I'm sure every athlete tuning in right now has had the experience where they've had like a lingering kind of shoulder pain, but I can still compete. Like I'm fine. I'm not gonna let it derail me. Or like the back's a little tight, whatever, screw it. I'm fine. Only a few months later to like be crippled by it, or it to be now it to be a crisis, some kind of an injury,
Yeah.
and we look back and we think, shit, I should have addressed it quicker. And I think our relationship with our own mental health is very similar. That when we like push stress or sadness or confusion away, yes, short term it feels like it's not there, but it's going to manifest. It can manifest in eating issues, it can manifest in sleeping issues, it can manifest in just general irritability, weight loss, weight gain. Everyone's different, but it's important to deal with what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, so dealing with what's going on, just could that mean just like, talking to someone, just kind of being open, having open conversations about it? You always say that would probably be the best thing. And for me, it's like talking to you, or it's talking to my parents, or it's talking to my roommate. That is that mainly what you're saying there?
And that's one of the most effective ways. But there is, and I think it's dangerous if you hear a coach ever tell you, well, this is the way to do this maneuver or this move. This is how to win. That could be a way to do it. There's never like the right way, as though there's only one way to cook a steak or juggle or dance merengue or do a De La Hiva. See, I promise myself to throw a De La Hiva.
Yeah, you know the terminology.
But arguably there are a multitude of ways of doing something effectively, which then allows a competitive. If I'm out there competing in my sport and I think, well, this is what I have to do. This is the only way to go about doing it. I'm very rigid and I'm very inflexible, as opposed to like reacting loosely to what's in front of me. So I think with most things in life, there are many ways of going about it. We can write. I think some people I've found really are being helped with journaling. Some people are using meditation or visualization as a way to kind of reconnect with their sport, especially being out of competition, to be able to like see and feel and taste and smell the competitive environment. Even if you're just rehearsing it mentally, it can be hugely effective. Obviously, communicating with a loved one or someone that you trust. And communication can take many forms. It can take your own internal like visualization as a way of communicating with a blank piece of paper, communicating with another person, communicating with music, or through some other kind of artistic method. So many different ways of going about it, but it usually starts with having a conversation with someone about how you're feeling, about kind of opening up about what's going on.
I like that. What you say is like just being adjustable and just and there's not one right way of doing things. I feel like that's where our conversations have always led to. For me, I always like wanted to follow like a certain rule book that people would give me, and I'd be like, okay, I'll follow it to a T. You've known me, and I was probably like that. But I feel like after more of like talking to you, and the more I would kind of like see where my mind's at, that it's not just one thing that works. We've gone so many different directions.
Yeah. Can I actually put you on the hot seat for a second, because I want to hear from you. Do you remember when that was? Do you remember, maybe not the specific tournament or moment, but generally when in your career you realized that you went from having this 38 item checklist, and I'm arbitrarily throwing a number out there, like, I have to do da-da-da-da-da in order to feel at my best, and then flowed into the more flexible approach, like there are many different ways to feel and get ready. Do you remember when that happened?
Oh man, is there a right answer to this? Because I can't really.
No, because I'm sure a lot of people listening are rigid and have this like non-negotiable checklist of I have to breathe 12 times, I have to stretch this way, I need 12 minutes to take care of this, as opposed to what if you only have 2 minutes, or what if the environment changes?
I mean, I guess I remember just a couple of years ago competing. I think it was like 2018, and I was competing like every other weekend. And I remember we'd always talk about, I always like to have a certain routine before. And like you said, like probably 38 short, you know, probably more than 30, it was probably more than 38 things on the checklist that I wanted to go, that I wanted to have. But I think the more I competed, the more I had all these different ranges of emotions. Sometimes I'd be tense, sometimes I'd be loose. And I realized that like none of them really like mattered so much.
Yeah.
It was, well, I forgot what I was getting at, but I just realized like, I guess doing all these tournaments and having all these different routines based on circumstance, I guess I became a little bit more like flexible and adjustable because I'm like, hey, it's not just this one routine that works best. Sometimes I could be
Yeah.
doing this, sometimes I could be doing that. And sometimes I realized that being rigid and being so set on a routine, if something threw that off, I'd be a mess, you know. But kind of being able to be
Yeah.
flexible was a much easier approach. It was like mentally I wouldn't have as much anxiety just because, you know, I was able to kind of just adjust and kind of just go with how the day is going, and just be able to move on as is or whatever. I don't know.
I think so. So I think that you're touching upon something important. That there was a period in your career, as there is in essentially every athlete's career, where the thought comes in of like, I have to be feeling this way to compete my
Yeah.
best. I need to be feeling confident to be my best. And then my follow-up question is, are you that terrible an athlete where you have to be feeling one particular way in order to perform your best? It's not possible. In fact, I'm sure if you were to think back to some of your best ever moments, they occurred when you were like feeling like you really had to poop yourself before competition, or where you felt like you were dizzy with nerves, or incredibly distracted. And I'm sure you can think of moments where you felt just as you wanted to, and things didn't go according to
Yeah.
plan. So
It,
yeah, go
Yeah,
on.
it took like just so many experiences to kind of just get that feeling. But I remember we talked about this and you had to remind me. I remember we were talking recently about like wanting to try to, you know, channel how I was feeling before in certain competitions because I was just feeling so on point. But then you even like did some research. You have like I can't even imagine how many notes you have on me now after all these years. You have books. You even
Thousands of
publish
pages.
books. But you actually read notes to me from our conversations about how I was like, you know, feeling anxious about certain things or how I was kind of feeling down, you know, during training, or I just wasn't enjoying. I remember, I won't go into full detail, but I do remember like you saying that things weren't mentally perfect, even at the times that I look at in my career and be like, that looked about as perfect as I can get, you know.
Yeah.
So there was never a time when things were just perfect, you know. It's just kind of going with how you feel at that time.
And you know what, Johnny? I think some of us have the luxury of working with like a mental skills coach who can point that stuff out. But for a lot of us who go about our lives or our professions without the aid of a mentor like that, I think this speaks to the idea that memory sucks. Everyone's memory sucks. We oftentimes remember that one or two like magical moments from a few years ago where we were competing with sheer confidence and things went well, and we use that as the basis to say, well, I have to always be confident, as opposed to remembering moments in which the complete opposite happened. So without the luxury of having like a coach who does your note dictating, that responsibility should be on the athlete. I think most athletes should have some form, there's no one right way to do it, some form of note taking in which they're identifying, how was I feeling this week in training, and how did my competition go? How did I feel the week before, the hour before, the minute before? How did I feel during? What did I take away from it afterwards? And oftentimes the writing itself isn't necessarily magical, but it's when you start compiling notes and observations from weeks or months that you can then look back on and start to notice patterns and start to come
Yeah.
to different realizations of what may or may not be true that your mind might be telling you. So I think that kind of segues into a good, takeaway point for some of your listeners, that if you're not doing your own mental training, and mental training doesn't have to mean sitting cross-legged and meditating for 12 hours, but it could mean like jotting down notes about what you were thinking or what you were feeling before this really incredible move, or this incredible moment, or this moment of distraction or irritability. What was going on right before that mentally for you? And then you start to become aware of some tendencies. So I think writing should be, or even at the very least, just reflecting for 5 or 10 minutes after practice, rather than quickly going on to the protein shake or to the next to do, to have a way to reflect on how things are going. And you do that really well, I know, over the
Yeah.
years.
Well, it's been on and off. Like I used to be like that one that would think I'd have to be sitting cross-legged visualizing for 12 hours in a day. But
Yeah.
and then that almost became like too much for me because I was like, oh, I can't do this because I don't know, like, and I would freak out with you because I'm like, oh, I didn't do my visualization today,
Yeah.
and I made it such a rigid thing. But once I kind of
Right.
started loosening up and allowing it to be something that I would just do when I felt like was the right time, then I felt
Yeah.
like it became much more valuable. But yeah, I always appreciated like the eval sheets that you would have me do in the beginning. Then it kind of became my own, to where like the talking about what techniques were working, what techniques weren't working. Sometimes it'd be more mentally, mental topics I would get into, but I always found those to be really helpful as well.
That's awesome. You've always been such a good student.
I know, I know, the best, right? The best.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Whatever.
Sure, sure, okay. Man, so I actually I wanted to get a little bit into your background and just how you got into this. I wanted to ask a little
Yeah.
bit about your influences. That's what my dad told me to get into a little bit. So I was like, what should I talk about with Greg? I'm not sure. He always talks about me. What do I talk about with him? But
That's a great
I
question,
mean,
Frank.
so
Yeah.
I mean, before you started getting into sports psychology, what was kind of like the leeway into that? What's your kind of sports background?
Yeah. So I grew up playing baseball. I mean, I dabbled in recreational basketball, but pretty much baseball was my specialty, and I played from age 5 through college, and I was good. I was a good college Division III baseball player, and but I was such a mental player. I would always get in my own way, and I have a twin brother who also had we played baseball growing up together, and his mental game was kind of similar. So there's got to be some genetic component to that, but. I would always get in my own way, meaning, I'd walk onto the field one day, and I'd be feeling really, and this is from, youth all the way up through my early 20s when I was playing in college. I'd be really focused on the right things. My body would feel great. I'd be excited to play. I'd want the ball. I'd want the action. I was like begging for the ball to be hit to me. I was kind of thinking about all the great things that might happen if I play well today. I wasn't all that interested in the weather or the fans. I was kind of locked in. And then inexplicably, the following day, I would feel completely crappy physically. I'd be really tense and tight, like literally shaking bodily, begging for the action to be away from me. Just visualizing what all my teammates would be thinking about me if I make another mistake, or if I strike out one more time. And during those games, I would play all right. I wouldn't play amazingly, and I wouldn't be a disaster, but I would play noticeably worse in those games than in the games in which I was feeling better. And when you're 9, 10, 12, 15 even, and through high school, at least for me, I didn't have the awareness or the desire to kind of check in with, well, what the hell's going on here? But
Yeah,
it really became in college when I began to think, it's the same. It's the same Greg. It's the same physical person. But
yeah,
it was such a different way that I was thinking about baseball, and that really affected how I played. And I think growing up, I always had this interest in human behavior, and I had this idea that I'd go into psychology just because it sounded good. It's like saying I'm going to go into astronomy when you're young because it sounds cool.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I always loved sports. And my mom, one day in my early teenage years, she said, there's a thing called sport psychology. It exists. And then so my interest in the field was kind of born, just like this marriage of two ideas that I found really, really fascinating to me. And even through college, when I knew that I was having an issue with anxiety, I would, you know, I would find band-aids. I mean, I would like sing songs to myself, or I would take a few deep breaths. Not to say that breathing is ineffective, but it's not a panacea. It's not like a cure-all. And so I would hope that a couple of deep breaths, because I saw a Nike ad once of somebody taking deep breaths, or I would watch athletes laser focused, so I would squint my eyes to try to be laser focused. These like untested, non-scientific ways of just kind of desperately trying to help myself led me to this interest that I so couldn't deal with my own mental stuff. And I always felt comfortable in conversation. I knew I wanted to go into a field in which I was interacting with people and have like that human touch. And so I find it, as I'm sure most people do, I find it so easy, so much easier now to dispense advice, to give advice, than I do like heeding my own advice. It's so much easier to give the good advice to somebody else than it is to kind of take your own good advice when you're going through something challenging. So I think this is kind of in my sweet spot of having my own athletic experience and having a lot of struggles with it, but feeling like I have the knowledge to kind of impart some ideas. So it was really born from my own mental crap, like my own inability to deal with it myself, that got me into the field.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting that you kind of had to go through your own struggles to kind of know what could work for other people, like tools to, help them through their mental struggles. It's funny, like
Yeah.
I always feel like some of the best coaches in jiu-jitsu are kind of the ones that didn't always have it super easy. The ones that maybe were like supernatural. And I was thinking like, oh, you've always had such great advice for me. My first thought would be like, oh, he must have had his shit together,
Right.
when he was in
Yeah.
high school, college playing. But then I'm thinking, well, how would he be able to derive those lessons if he didn't have those same mental blocks as well?
That's a really good point.
So for me, I always noticed in jiu-jitsu, it's the people that maybe weren't able to like understand the techniques right away, that really had to break it down detail by detail, are some of the best teachers because it didn't come easy to them either because they had their own struggles. For me, I
Exactly
think
right.
what helps me teaching classes is that like nothing came easy to me. It took me like 18 years to get halfway decent in anything, but I had to really focus on the details to improve, so
Yeah.
then I can explain that. Whereas some people, it works for them, and it's kind of hard for them to put into words why it works so well.
Right. Right. So if you're naturally a sharp focuser, um, then you probably don't have really good advice for somebody who's struggling with focus. Your advice would probably be, well, just focus, which is the advice that I got from a lot of coaches growing up, and which is clear that that coach has never had to deal with what I'm dealing with. So yeah, I guess if you're a coach or a trainer in any capacity, having dealt with your own struggles will make you empathetic. It makes you relate to what that kid or that athlete is going through. It kind of reminds me of the story it was like circulating around the sports psychology blogosphere a couple of years ago. This college football coach, this offensive line coach, is working with one of his athletes who can't seem to get the technique down right. And the offensive line coach huffs and puffs into his athletic director's office and says, Coach, I've got the stupidest kid in America. I've told him 100 times the same thing, and he's not getting it. To which the athletic director replies, you must be the stupidest coach in America. He's clearly not getting it, and you haven't changed your approach to him 100 straight times. So I think oftentimes a coach feels like, well, the responsibility is on the kid. Like, change, figure it out. But
Yeah.
oftentimes, if I'm giving the same wrong advice, how can I expect the athlete to adapt or make any adjustments? The responsibility's got to be on me to make adjustments too. So I think, yeah, you're right. A lot of the best coaches have gotten their hands dirty and have had to figure stuff out on their own rather than having it come flawlessly or naturally to them.
Have there been things that really haven't gotten through my head that you've had over the years that you've had to like make adjustments for? Like, and maybe anything I didn't know of that, or you know what I
You know
mean?
what I mean? I think one of the things that was hardest for you in the first few years was the idea of adjusting or the idea of being flexible. I think you like a lot of athletes, you knew like the importance of being adaptable, but like, hey, if that coach said I need to do this for 12 minutes, God damn it, I need to do this for 12 minutes. Or if I need to get 8 hours of sleep, it has to be 8 hours. And if it's any less, then I'm panicking. So I think it wasn't a matter of you not like being aware of it. I think you were aware of it. There's a difference between not being aware of something and not choosing to absorb something. And I think a lot of us will know something. It's important to be a loving husband. It's important to spend time with my kids. It's important to work on my legs and not just my biceps. You know, it's one thing to say things like that, and another thing to actually ingest the pill of
Yeah.
advice and live it. So I mean, there have been countless things over the years where you, particularly, but you know, with all athletes, are aware of what needs to change, but we're not like quite willing to dip our foot in the water and make that change. But now you're like you're the adjustment king. So come on.
Trying to be. I mean, and also like just kind of going back to everything going on now, like I do feel like a lot of our talks and talking about adjustment, you know, mainly it'd be for like training, it'd be for competition, but that's been super helpful during this time as well. You know, it's just, you know,
Yeah,
this is a time where we've had to force ourselves to be like more creative with, you know, training routines or whatever from there. So
sure.
I'm thankful for that. You know, you needed to tell me to get a schedule going. You know, that was something that I needed to hear. But, you know, all the advice I got from about you had to kind of like pound into my brain a little bit about
But
being able to be flexible. But go ahead and say.
just think about well, I think what you're saying is really beautiful because the idea of making a schedule is so rudimentary. It's so basic. We almost expect like a 9-year-old to be able to understand. You know, make a schedule. But here's how old are you now? Like 42. You're getting old, right? 26.
28. Come on.
28.
Come on.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so we have this 28-year-old, you know, world-class athlete who had to be reminded to make a schedule. So I think that doesn't speak to how inept you are. I think it speaks to how, like, as we live our lives, it can be really easy to kind of let ideas slip out of our hands, especially in the middle of a disaster or like a major life change. Some of these basic ideas, like how to take care of ourselves, can fall by the wayside if we're not really paying attention to them. Kind of like if you're holding your younger sister's hand in the middle of New York City, and there's the Statue of Liberty. If you're gawking at that, you might kind of loosen your grip, and off she goes into the throng of people. You have to kind of like hold your grip tightly on important ideas. You're not the only one who lost sight of, you know, making a schedule when the feces hit the fan here.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. That's good to know. Well, so for you coming up, like, well, for me, I always had like certain influences in jiu-jitsu, but also like within my sport and then within, you know, outside my sport as well. What were like some people that were like your biggest influences getting into like psychology?
I think that the major influences for me were the sports psychology experts who, you know, when I first started like learning about the field and developing an interest in it, I would write letters to some of the professionals I found on databases or online, kind of like the kind of emails that I get now from eager high school or college students who want to learn a little bit more about the field. It's very bizarre to think, because in that moment you would never, just like you when you were a young teenager, you would never think of having tens of thousands of Instagram followers or people clamoring to hear what you have to say, because you
Yeah.
were one of those kids like craning your neck and looking up at the gods above you, and now I'm sure some view you as that way. So I think for me, I reached out to some people in the field, and what inspired me most, because you know, sports psychology, unlike like mainstream sports, there were very few role models to follow. It's a very small field. Over the last 15 years, it's grown. But when I first started, it was like a very ancillary field. It wasn't a main thing at all. In fact, I think there were like 2 Major League Baseball teams that employed mental skills coaches, and now every freaking team has one. So I think that's like
Yeah.
indicative of how embraced it's become. But back then, it was like a nothing field. So it's not like I can like watch TV or you know, be blatantly exposed to someone who's in the field. I had to almost take out the shovel and dig a little bit to find someone. And the ones who really inspired me were the ones who were approachable, the ones who actually gave their time to talk to me. And
Yeah.
I now know, as I'm sure you now know, that when your time is limited and you get a question from somebody who's less experienced than you, you know, the tendency could be just to kind of poo-poo it away or maybe not answer it. And I vividly remember the feeling of calling people experts in the field, and I would say, "Do you have a couple of minutes? I want to ask you." And before I even finished, they would say, "I'm too busy. I'm not looking for an intern." Goodbye. Like assuming that I was looking for something that left a really bad taste in my mouth. And I think what really warmed me and what really inspired me was the professionals who were doing great things in their field would take 18 minutes to write me an email, or even a couple who would write me a handwritten note. This one professional, Jack Llewellyn, who I don't think is any longer practicing in the field, he was the sports psychologist for a lot of major pro athletes in the Atlanta area. And he wrote me this 2-page handwritten letter, which must have taken at least 28 minutes, maybe like 45 minutes. And for somebody who's so busy to take time out, that didn't go unnoticed or unappreciated by me. And so I think that was a big inspiration. And also, there were some professionals, and coming from baseball, I think it was easier for me to read about sports psychology as it related to that sport. And people like Ken Ravizza or Harvey Dorfman are these professionals who worked in pro baseball, but wrote really simply and really in a really applicable way. It wasn't clinical, it wasn't abstract, it was simple language, and you felt like you can really digest it. And I think that's an approach that every professional in my field or in coaching should take, not to overwhelm an athlete with confusing jargon, not to impress people with how much you know, but to hand over on a silver platter basic, simple, understandable information in very simple language. And so the early readings in the field inspired me to do that, and I think the early interactions I had with the professionals who gave me their time also was a big inspiration for me.
So you feel like the ones that were just very personable with you and would just be very, the ones that were easier to approach and that weren't going to give you like, either some solid strict answer or no answer at all, were the ones that you gravitated towards most, right?
100%. Yeah. The ones who were like relatable, the ones who didn't put themselves on a pedestal and say, "Listen, little boy, let me tell you the way," or the ones who didn't give me any time at all, but the ones who stood at my level and said, "I remember what it was like when I was your age. It's so great that you're interested in the field. Let me give you a couple of ideas to help you move forward."
Yeah.
I think a lot of people will take themselves, like, the higher in level they go in their field, the more seriously they take themselves. Like, I'm not important at all. I'm getting important. I'm really important. Fuck you. I don't have any time for you. So like the higher you go, you almost feel like there's not enough time in my busy, important day. So not taking yourself too seriously is a supremely attractive quality in a human being. I don't think I have any friends or colleagues who I want to spend any time with who are too self-important, who take themselves too seriously. It's not a fun way of spending time.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this talk with you then, because after all my thousands of followers that are going to see you now, and then you're going to become huge after this.
At least 300 followers.
I'm going to notice the shift in your tone when we talk now. It's like,
I'll be cursing a lot more at you and talking down to you. That's probably going to happen.
I think I remember, like, tell me if I'm wrong, but I remember when we first started talking, or my dad gave me your number, and he's like, call this guy, call Greg, and see if we can, if you could talk to him. And I was scared shitless, because I was expecting this high authority who just like, I almost expected someone to see me as like someone with a problem, because I had these mental blocks in competing or in training and stuff like that. But I do believe that early on you did tell me about like you playing baseball and you telling me about certain things. I do recall you telling me about the same issues that you would have. And I remember feeling comfortable, way more comfortable, knowing that like this guy, has been at my level before, and I feel like he can relate to me. I can relate to him in certain ways. And that was the biggest thing that helped me and make it easier. To where I remember the first conversation we had, I was like stiff on your couch and like just like afraid to move. But then after years, it didn't even take years, but just after a couple talks, I remember just being like comfortable because you felt personal at that point.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That you don't have to be a psychologist to be aware of like posture. And I think for me, when a lot of new athletes come in, you could, like, they're literally and figuratively closed, like they're kind of like cross-armed, or their legs are together and they're looking down, eyebrows are furrowed. It's hard to open your mind, to open your heart, to open yourself up to a professional who you think is going to be tampering with your mind. So yeah, I think posturally and emotionally, you were rigid and very closed, and you were kind of unsure about what it was going to all be about. Um, and I guess that's also a unique point for coaches to be aware of, that when you're working with a young or an inexperienced athlete, or any kind of an athlete, that you don't have to say, oh, well, looking at posture, for instance, is only for the psychologist. I think everyone can kind of notice how somebody is feeling without them having to vocalize how they're feeling. Sometimes it's evident in just how they're carrying themselves. So for a lot of coaches who are dealing with athletes, even just opening up their eyes to trying to understand that there's a lot of information I can get from this athlete just through nonverbal communication, I think that's a really important key. And I'm always aware of how an athlete is looking and presenting themselves to me, just as a way to tell me how open they are to the process. But yeah, I feel like a lot of people initially will think, well, I'm going to see a sports psychologist or a mental skills coach because I'm broken. I've got a problem, and this person's here to fix me. But, and I'm remembering for me, when I first entered the field, I probably had a very similar idea. The idea that, there's a certain level of athlete that's perfect, like the tall, muscular, good-looking, fat-walleted professional athletes probably don't need me. What the hell do they need me for? I mean, look at them. Look how symmetrical their jawline is. They have all the confidence in the world. And I remember like 13, 14 years ago, in my first few years, I had the opportunity to collaborate with this NFL agent who let me do some work with his players before the combine and before their pro days. In other words, before they were kind of going out for their NFL tryout. And some of these athletes were very large and very muscular and very intimidating. And my first assumption was, like, they don't need me. I mean, they're physically impressive, and so therefore they must be mentally impressive. That's such a dangerous assumption to make. Like, I look at you with the perfect haircut and think he's got it all going on, but you don't have it going on. No one has it going on. That's
no,
the
this
thing.
is all just a facade. All this professional look right here. I'm a mess. Like I said, I look like I'm a captain of a ship. Or what did I say? I'm a captain of a paddle boat with holes.
Yeah,
in
with
it.
holes.
Yeah.
But that's a very comforting thing. That when we all realize nobody has any idea what the hell they're talking about, no one really knows exactly what they're doing. We're just kind of figuring out in the moment that life is suffering. Like, everyone suffers in some way. It makes us feel like we're not alone. We're not kind of dealing with our own anxiety. Every athlete under the sun has experienced competitive anxiety, has experienced doubt and fear and worry. It's inhuman to not experience those things. So yeah, I think you in your gladiatorial sport came to see me like a shrink, which probably made you feel like, what the hell do I need him for? This is a sign of weakness.
No, I don't even think it wasn't even like a sign of what do I need him for. It was more like, shit, what's wrong with me because I need to talk to this guy.
Right.
I think it was mainly that.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit, not to get too sidetracked, but like, why do you think it wasn't such a big thing years ago? Maybe it was just obviously the information wasn't out there, but was there any other issues as to why, like, sports psychology and mental training, which seems so big now, and especially in certain sports, is like, was not too long ago just not even existent?
You know what? I think a lot of it is that we fear what we don't know. I think we fear the unknown. Just like it's very easy to be afraid of different people, of different cultures or different religions or backgrounds or skin colors or sizes that are different from ours. If we don't understand something or someone, it's easy to be afraid of them or angry at them. And I think similarly that, there was a time where strength and conditioning was seen as like an ancillary thing. It was seen as a side thing. Like, why do we have to invest time in that? But the more we understood the human body and human physiology and how the body interacts with stress and recovery and how it can be a performance enhancer, then it became more embraced and accepted. And the brain still to this day is very unknown. Even the most expert neurologists and cognitive scientists aren't fully aware of nearly the extent of how the brain operates. So I think a lot of athletes, when they're going into, just like if they were to go into a strength coach and the athlete, him or herself, has no understanding of the human body, they're going to feel just as afraid as if they were going into to see a mental skills coach if they didn't have any idea or understanding of how the brain worked. So oftentimes, most athletes who have, to this day, have a pretty firm understanding of how their body works, don't really have all that firm an understanding of how their mind operates or its effect on stress. So I think the idea of going in to see someone like me, there's a lot of unknown, and with a lot of unknown, there's some resistance to that.
Did it take kind of like a build up? Like you said, there was only a couple sports teams way back in the day that would have that approach. But was there ever like a certain, I don't know if you know about the history of like that beginning, but was there like just a noticeable difference in certain teams or something like that that would kind of, or certain individuals, they'd be like, oh shit, what's this all about? Maybe I should be talking to someone as well. And was that something that kind of helped build it up?
Yeah, and I'm not firmly educated on like the history. The history dates back a couple of hundred years, and at least to the very early parts of the 20th century, late 19th century in North America. But that's pretty much what happened. Is that researchers and scientists were pioneers in the field and approached certain sports teams or athletes and decided to do this really revolutionary idea of mental skills training, and those teams or athletes tended to enhance their performance. And I think even in the Olympic field, when North America many decades ago, peered over across the ocean to like the then Eastern Bloc countries like the Soviet Union, we were noticing that their athletic success was far greater, and one of the reasons was that they were deliberately training their concentration. They were deliberately training their mental skills. They would, for better or for worse, they would put their athletes under intense duress, like physical discomfort, and force them to concentrate on solving problems or doing difficult cognitive tasks. And I think like in more ethical ways that's been introduced to the States here. But it really it takes, I think, in a lot of areas of newness, in a lot of new fields, you have to have some proven track record. You have to notice its efficacy and notice that it's working before it becoming more embraced. So I think you're right with that.
It just takes time. And also, do you feel like people would kind of like, there's kind of like a stigma behind it a little bit? People wouldn't want to like open up about wanting to talk to. I remember you even said, "Oh, you don't have to ever mention me." It was something I always felt comfortable saying, that I talked to someone. But I know there's
Yeah.
people that wouldn't feel comfortable with that because they would feel like that was like that there would be something wrong with them, or they'd be judged for it or something like that.
Yeah, I think there is a huge stigma, and I think a lot of it has to do with a lack of understanding. But really, I mean, if you think of the parallels, nobody would tell their nutritionist, "Hey, listen, I don't want you to tell anyone that we're working together," or their strength coach. Like, keep it on the down low. I don't want people to know I'm working with a strength coach. I think eventually it's going to come to that. But I vividly remember early on that when I was working with some pro athletes, their agents who I was working with in hockey and in football would say to me, he really wants or she wants this kept secretive. Like it was an active conversation to make sure that I wasn't publicizing my work with them, and I never would. That would be unethical. But it just goes to show that a lot of athletes may think of training their mind as a sign of weakness, like something's wrong with me, in a way that they simply wouldn't with strength training. You don't go to a strength trainer and say, like, something's really wrong with me. You say, like, I'm not maximizing my physical potential, so I'm going to work with somebody who's going to teach me how to do that. It's the same relationship. Very few of us are maximizing our mental potential, and working with a mental skills coach assists an athlete in getting closer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, like in the beginning, I was kind of the same way. I wouldn't want to say anything because it was something that I felt like, oh, there's just something wrong with me that I'm trying to work on.
Yeah.
But after having so many people come up to me, especially like people who would just eventually come to me for advice, and they asked me if I would do mental training. Once I saw that there would be so many people that would actually come up to me, and a lot of times they wouldn't even really ask me about technical questions.
Yeah.
They would ask me more about like mindset questions, and I could tell that like people would have their own difficulties in that area. So I'm like, oh yeah, I talked to this guy and he's helped me out with this, and this is some of the advice he's given me. So it helped me become more open just by seeing how it affects so many people and how many people could really benefit from it as well.
Yeah, and it really does take high profile athletes like you to normalize this stuff. And just a couple of years ago, Kevin Love, who's an NBA star, wrote this now gone viral article about, I think it was titled "Everyone is going through something" or "Everyone is dealing with something." He was very candid about his panic attacks that he would get, and then
Hmm.
athletes would come out about their depression or their diagnosable psychosis or neurosis that what that does is it forces lay people to say, okay, well, they're successful and they're living a fine life, and they're like they're also balancing this issue or this condition, which
Hmm.
then makes it seem less like wrong or bad, but more human and more normal.
No, makes sense. I was gonna ask something else, but maybe we have like about like 8 minutes left. It cuts off after an hour.
Oh boy, come on.
Went by fast. One person was asking, one of my teammates actually, he asked, any thoughts on coaching skills or principles that athletes can use on themselves? Um, uh, any thoughts on that at all? Or
Yeah, and I'm guessing he means principles as far as like mental skills principles that athletes can use
yes,
on
yeah,
themselves.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, in 7 minutes, I wouldn't
Sorry,
be
I
able
know.
to do it justice. But no, but it's a
Of
funny
course,
question to begin. I think the ideas of like reflecting, like writing, and internal reflection are really important. But I think one of the if you're looking at the four core mental skills that you're taught in cognitive behavioral therapy approaches: goal setting, relaxation training, self-talk, and imagery or visualization. I think
yeah.
that if we're looking to get incredibly simple, coaching skills specifically, coaching. So I'm going to keep talking until maybe he clarifies, because I want to make sure I'm addressing the question with
Yeah,
precision.
either way,
So
it's a good answer.
um, I think that if we're looking at those four basic ideas, we can begin to think, like, how am I using those in my coaching life? In other words, I remember uh, I'm forgetting his first name, Phil Jackson, the longtime Knicks and Bulls coach. He would say, um, "I never let my heart rate get above 100 beats per minute." That's so smart, isn't it? I never let my heart rate get too high, because he knows that when his heart rate gets too high, he begins to make bad decisions, and he starts to talk to his players in a impulsive way, and he begins to talk to them, which then raises his players' tension levels, which then makes the way that they perform worse. So I think as a coach, you have to be very aware of like the kind of image that you're presenting to your players, um, and how you are internally. Um,
Don't pay attention to these comments get weird.
the comments are getting weird. Yeah, well, things get weird usually at the end of stuff. Um, so I would say, as far as coaching, if we're thinking like, what are the like most important goals that I want to accomplish, and not like taking out your binoculars and looking at the like, your 5 year goals, but what are some of the important things that I want to take care of today? What demands my attention this week? And the thing with goals is that they're fluid and they can change, but like having a focal point, things that you focus your attention on, um, which then like makes it easier to return to that if that's in your mind. I think something like self-talk is what Phil Jackson's talking about. Like if I'm talking to myself in a calm way, I'm able to be like as relaxed as I need to be. I'm able to be at my right level in order to be my best coach. And the ideas of visualization are really about, like, are you rehearsing ideas and skills in your head, the kind of skills that you want to be doing in real life? I remember hearing athletes say things like, you never want to arrive anywhere on the field or on the mat where you haven't already been for at least a couple of seconds in your mind. You always want to have
Yeah,
been there before actually being there. So
yeah,
oftentimes, if you're entering a new situation, you might not be able to physically practice it, but you can certainly envision what you think it's going to feel like, what the emotions are going to be like, as much of the environment as you know. That's why I think doing your homework is important. And I think for an athlete who's entering a competition where they've never been to that atmosphere before, get to know the sounds. Like maybe watch videos about what it sounds like in there. Understand what it looks like so that when you're visualizing, you're kind of factoring in these realistic images of you there. Um, I know a lot of outdoor athletes will factor in like climate. You know, if they're going to be competing in wind or rain or snow, they'll make that a part of their mental rehearsal. So I think the more vivid we can make our mental preparation, the more it's going to benefit us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you reminded me of all that stuff because I remember how much in the beginning we talked about all those different things. You know, visualization, self-talk. We even like would write out scripts. And one thing I remember, you sent me a video that we watched once. What was it? It was like almost like the air, like the guys in the planes, like going through like the court obstacle.
Yeah,
What do you call
the
that?
Red
What was
Bull.
that?
Yeah, it was the Red Bull air racing team.
Yeah, and we're kind of using that as like an example of us kind of like visualizing what we're gonna do before, or even kind of like making a script for being in something because so they feel like okay, I've already been there or I've been in a situation. I
Exactly.
remember that being really useful because I would like to actually, for me, this is what I would do. I would go to the tournaments if I had the luxury of going to a tournament the day before I would actually be competing. I remember doing this in Brazil because Brazil is a crazy environment. And I wanted to just be able to like kind of, I wanted to see the arena. I wanted to like see what mat. I even knew which mat I was going to be on. And I would just watch that area for a while and just kind of see myself in that area. So I remember that being super useful because when I went out there, granted the crowd was crazy. I was like the only gringo out there. You know, I was like the only American. It could be a little intimidating, you know, and especially when they say they don't want the Americans to win, especially in Brazil, it's kind of a known thing.
Right.
But I was like, I felt comfortable because I felt like I'd already been there. You know, it wasn't like this new feel for me. I remember that tool being super effective for me.
Yeah, that's a great example.
So we literally got a minute left.
Oh boy.
We literally
Okay.
got a minute left.
Yeah.
All
Are
right.
there final questions there for me, or should I just start spitting out shit?
Just you could start saying random shit that's going on in your life.
Yeah. Well,
I
I'm
don't
looking
know.
at a certain I'm looking at a certain comment that's kind of unsettling down
Well,
below.
yeah, that's what I told. That's what you weren't paying attention to that. I was like, oh, just watch out. There's some weird stuff, like you said, that comes on at the end. But
Yeah.
I mean, 40 seconds. I'll just wrap it up and say, man, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Of
Guys,
course.
if you yeah, just I'll share your account so you know that. But any final words on your part, or we're just gonna
I think that for those who dedicated an hour to listening, I definitely applaud you because it's not easy to carve out this kind of time, especially for something that maybe you're not comfortable with, like mental skills training. So see if you can take